going to start Unit 3, which we call Finding the Immigrant Voice. I'd like to read a quote from David McCullough before we start. History is not about politics and war only, not by any means. Music and poetry are very much a part of history. In this curriculum, we are going to use music, poetry, and art. And in the third unit, music will be our focus. Because in the first two units, we've given you plenty of historical context, a knowledge of the past. We've also given you activities to promote historical thinking. But now let's use music as a primary source to engage our students in historical thinking. Because, as we know, through the arts, particularly music, we give a voice to the voiceless. And we also help our students find their voice, whether it be in music, poetry, art activities. Students can then own their scholarship by expressing their thoughts. Let's go on to Unit 3, which we're calling Finding the Immigrant Voice. The first voice we'd like to hear from today is Alter Brody. Alter Brody was born in Russia in 1903. He was one of the first Jewish American poets to write of Jewish themes, subjects, and issues. He wrote in free verse, like Walt Whitman. He wrote of loss, alienation, loneliness, despair, all a part of the immigrant experience. We've picked out two of his poems in particular, Ghetto Twilight and Times Square. Challenge students to compare it with Walt Whitman's You, Whoever You Are, or any of the Harlem Renaissance poets that we'll do next week. But on to music. We are recreating the world of George and Ira Gershwin, whose parents emigrated from Russia to the Lower East Side. What would have been the sounds of New York? What were those immigrant voices? How would they find their own voice? Well, let's look at musical influences on the Gershwins, particularly as an immigrant family in New York City. One of the musics that Gershwin certainly would have heard would have been klezmer music. This is the musical tradition of Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe. They are dance tunes and instrumentals played for weddings and celebrations by professional musicians. They have expressive melodies reminiscent of the human voice, imitative, laughing, and weeping. Gershwin was influenced by this Yiddish music, as were other immigrant kids like Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw, two jazz clarinetists who grew up playing klezmer music. You will hear the klezmer clarinet in one of Gershwin's most famous compositions, Rhapsody in Blue. What does klezmer music sound like? We have a musical selection, Hava Nagila, I bet you've heard that, by Yoselmeyer and his Jewish orchestra. Enjoy this well-known klezmer tune. One of the other ways that the immigrants found their voice was through theater. Yiddish theater was extremely popular. It expressed the emotions of immigrants. Themes were very close to the heart. The loss of Europe, immigrant frustrations, family conflict, older generation, younger generation. The erosion of faith, temptations, family burdens, serious issues. But it was community theater, funny, maybe tragic, instructive, but highly interactive. The audience was expected to participate. These theaters were widely popular, and they became a conduit between Jewish and American musics, particularly in the 19-teens and 1920s. Two elegant major theaters opened on 2nd Avenue in the 1920s. And 2nd Avenue became known as the Yiddish Broadway. Yiddish Broadway gave rise to a small Yiddish filmmaking industry and Yiddish radio. But most importantly, Yiddish theater created a communal identity. Perhaps two of the most famous people to arise from Yiddish theater were two Ukrainian immigrants, Boris and Bessie Tomaszewski. They were two of Yiddish theater's biggest stars, who actually owned the People's Theater and the National Theater. Their theater productions did not shy away from addressing social issues. Their theater productions were wildly popular. As a matter of fact, a real Tomaszewski was considered one that was dramatic and over the top. You may know of their grandson, Michael Tilson Thomas, the director of the San Francisco Symphony. We have many resources on Yiddish theater on the content outline. Please check them out. It's a fascinating aspect of Jewish American culture in New York City. Another Jewish influence was that on popular music, and I am talking Tin Pan Alley. Musical influences from Jewish immigrant kids themselves on the Gershwins have to be recognized. And of course, the biggest, the most impressive impression would have been made by Irving Berlin, Tin Pan Alley's greatest song composer. He lived from 1888 to 1889, born Israel Isidore Berlin in Tyumen, Georgia. He had a Yiddish-speaking home. His compositions, however, were written in standard 32-bar American song form. He had a very similar background and upbringing to George and Ira Gershwin, and as a result became a role model for the brothers. He's one of the most popular songwriters in the United States, writing such tunes as God Bless America, Alexander's Ragtime Band, White Christmas, and Cheek to Cheek. His Broadway musical works include Puttin' on the Ritz, Easter Parade, and Annie, Get Your Gun. Let's now take a listen to one of his most popular songs, Cheek to Cheek. Another really important Jewish immigrant influence on American music, as well as the Gershwin brothers, was Eddie Cantor. Eddie Cantor was actually born in New York City, Edward Israel Itzkowitz. He started his career in Yiddish theater, but wanted to sing jazz. So that took him to Detroit. And he sang with the Jean Colquet Orchestra. Interestingly enough, it is the arrangers of this orchestra that will help make George Gershwin famous. We have a direct connection here, Eddie Cantor to the arrangers who will help with the arrangement of Rhapsody in Blue. But Eddie Cantor was known as not just a great performance, but he also used slang. And his use of slang inspired Ira Gershwin, who just happened to be an English major. Ira being fascinated with language. One of Eddie Cantor's most famous songs was Makin' Whoopee. Let's listen to Makin' Whoopee, sung by Edward Israel Itzkovitz, better known as Eddie Cantor. Another famous, recognizable Jewish immigrant musical influence would be that of Al Jolson. Al Jolson was born Asa Jolson in Lithuania, which was a part of the Russian Empire. George Gershwin's first hit song, Swanee, was actually sung by Al Jolson. He starred in the first talking picture, The Jazz Singer. Many of you know he performed in blackface. And blackface, we know in our culture today, is not acceptable. But we have to put this in historical context. And Noble Sissle, a great African-American Broadway producer himself, said, but it was he, Al Jolson, who was always the champion of the Negro songwriter and performer, and was first to put Negroes in his shows. He's considered one of the most famous and highest paid entertainers from the 1920s. He had a spectacular stage presence, and his style defined the modern American musical. He is credited with introducing jazz and blues music to white audiences. A big influence on American music, particularly on American performers such as Bing Crosby, Tony Bennett, Neil Diamond, Jackie Wilson, and countless others. Let's listen to one of his most famous performances, Mammy, written by Irving Berlin. The Yiddish Daily Forward reviewed the music that they were hearing from these Jewish immigrant kids. I quote, "It is a curious thing that there are so many points of resemblance between Jews and Negroes. Is there an incongruity in this Jewish boy Jolson, with his face painted like a Southern Negro singing in the Negro dialect? No, there is not. Indeed, I detected again and again the minor key of Jewish music, the wail of the Kazan, the cry of anguish of a people who had suffered. The son of a line of rabbis well knows how to sing the songs of the most cruelly wronged people in the world's history." The Jewish immigrant American kids of Tin Pan Alley definitely impacted American music. And this impact was felt on the Gershwin boys. Their Lower East Side world consisted of frequenting Yiddish theaters, sometimes even performing in Yiddish theater. But George's music was rejected by Yiddish theater as sounding too American. So George actually became a song plugger at the age of 15 for the Jerome H. Remick and Company in New York City. And as we mentioned, his first national hit song was Swanee, recorded by one Al Jolson in 1919. But there were also classical music influences in 20th century America. They are extremely popular at turn of the century America, particularly when the Gershwin boys are growing up. What is the classical music influences that we can hear in 20th century America? We would be incomplete if we did not include the magnificent voice of Enrico Caruso. the operatic tenor, possibly the most famous tenor in history, who was born in Naples, Italy. His international popularity for dramatic singing, forceful projection, and gentle lyricism won him audiences throughout the world. But his greatest fame came at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City from 1902 to 1920. He was a master of the bel canto style, his stage presence being a model for all performers. His historic recording of 10 arias in 1902 were an unprecedented commercial success. It created a demand for solo recordings and spurred the growth of the recording industry. He influenced not only the Gershwin brothers, but the stage presence and the manner in which he approached the music of one Louis Armstrong. Let's listen to Mamma Mia, one of his most popular performances. We also need to take a look at French composers that dominated the classical music scene at this time. One of the most important composers was Erik Satie, who lived from 1866 to 1925, writing compositions for piano that emphasized simplicity, repetition, and original modal harmonies. He was a pianist that performed in Montmartre, and he blended the music hall musics with the popular tunes and created his own music, classical music. He embraced the absurd and the surreal. He collaborated on anti-conventional ballets and wrote background music for surrealist films, where he synchronized his music with the pictures. Let's listen to a composition of Erik Satie's that I know you will recognize. Gymnopédie, number 1. Another amazing French composer from this era was Claude Debussy, living from 1862 to 1918. Now, he was influenced by Wagner and Borodin and Mussorgsky, two Russian composers. His music is characterized by non-traditional scales and tonal structures, parallel harmonies, mixed orchestral colors, melody with very unconventional harmonies. He experimented with timbre and freed music from formal conventions. He challenged the traditional usage of instruments. He often said music is made up of colors and barred rhythms. His music was inspired by this literary symbolist movement, and you can hear it in his haunting and dissonant chords. The poor man died during the German bombing of Paris during World War I, but he was one of the most influential composers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Indeed, as one composer said, Debussy is one of the most profound composers of his time. We have a number of selections that you can listen to, such as Clair de Lune, La Mer, or Afternoon of a Faun, which was Debussy's ballet choreographed by the great Nijinsky. Another French composer of the time was Maurice Ravel, 1875 to 1937. He is the most widely popular and studied of French composers. His precision of orchestration was a model for so many others, but he adapted and manipulated traditional elements of Baroque and neoclassicism, infusing them with jazz. His music was very technically challenging. He wrote ballets that were choreographed by Diaghilev and danced by Nijinsky. He orchestrated Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition, considering it a fulfillment of the original. He might be most remembered for his composition Bolero, which was an experimentation with musical form, contrast, and varied repetition. It is the theme song from the movie 10. It was introduced in New York City in 1929, and it is infused with jazz and the blues. Other compositions of Ravel's was the Piano Concerto for the Left Hand, which he wrote for pianists who had loss of the right hand due to World War I. With its jazzy influence, it became very popular. Also, violin sonata in G major and blues. Maurice Ravel, who experimented with jazz and blues. Let's listen to perhaps that most famous composition, Bolero. The last musical influence we'd like to talk about is that of Igor Stravinsky. He lived from 1882 to 1970, considered one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. A student of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, he will be a major influence on American composers, particularly that of Aaron Copland. He's a modernist with liberated rhythm, with a primitivism and technical innovation in rhythm and harmony that none had ever heard before. He would leave Russia a refugee of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. His performances of music would be banned in Russia from 1933 to 1962. But he will write the music for 3 legendary ballets performed by the Ballet Russe: The Firebird, The Rite of Spring, and Petrushka. These ballets would be staged by the great Sergei Diaghilev and choreographed by Nijinsky. The Rite of Spring was actually premiered in the spring of 1924 and was attended by George Gershwin. Let's take a listen to The Rite of Spring. The classical influences on the Gershwins were enormous. Caruso records were in the Gershwin home. They were both deeply influenced and intrigued by the French composers, George even visiting Paris in the 1920s, and the Magnificent An American in Paris is a result of his stay. He will study with a Russian composition teacher, where the impact of Rubinstein and Dvorak on his work will be enormous. Hans Keller once said, "The structural outlines of the Rubinstein and Dvorak are remembered in virtually every Gershwin song."